I just want to talk about this movement which is going on, which is called, I mean, there are different strands to it. We can't look at it as a unified movement. You have the Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninist. Now, you have some very outstanding people who are office bearers of that party. They have a very strong labor wing, they have a farm workers wing, they have a women's wing. They do a lot of work across the country, and they are functioning, if not entirely legally, definitely very openly in the big cities of the country. So you have the CPI-ML, some into one or two factions, but the Marxist-Leninist branch of the Communist Parties of India. You have people who call themselves Maoists or who are considered Maoists by society around them. You have smaller groups of people who are taking to violence. And you also have some groups who are basically just businessmen. I mean, they take to violence, they use the cover of ideology basically to extort money in terms of ransom, in terms of kidnapping, in terms of toll, and almost in terms of a tax in several parts of the country, which come under the effective control for some length of time. So it's a very fractionated movement, and I think it's important for us to understand that so that we don't get into the trap of believing that this is one unified movement. Because there are some common characteristics to it. And one is, of course, what we call the ideology of Maoist ideology. Now, there have been different facets of Mao Zedong, the gentleman Chairman Mao, who brought communism to China. This is the Maoist facet which basically represents Mao during the Cultural Revolution. And it's interesting that the Naxalite movement came during the time when the Cultural Revolution was really in full tilt. And this represented a challenge of authority. Whoever was an authority, even if it is within the Communist Party, Chairman Mao gave a very clear instruction to his cadre: bombard the headquarters, bombard my own party, bombard my own party people and do much worse to them. So this is the Chairman Mao of the Cultural Revolution that is basically inspiring the Maoist movements here, a challenge to authority. The second, I think, a very powerful strand, which I think Nandini has and Himanshu have very correctly mentioned, is the anti-feudal strand. There are large parts of the country where there are still feudal vestiges, where people who are smaller peasants, people who are landless laborers, are treated very roughly, and they have very few rights. Now, you have some parts of the country where women have very few rights. You have some parts of the country where linguistic and other minorities have very few rights. You can say that, from the north to the west to other locations, you've got places where different minorities have very few rights. But here, basically, the question of, it's a very strong contra-feudal movement in which they are demanding rights. And they're demanding rights basically not in the name of the Constitution of India, not in the name of the process of election, democratic election, etc., that you vote, you get in a change. They say very clearly that this does not work, this is not operative. That is, the Constitution of India is a wonderful document, but it's just not effective in the places where we are operating. Law and order is a great concept, but it's not effective. And the political process is just not delivering justice to us. So that's a common strand in their thinking. One common strand which I think Ajit here has highlighted very clearly, which without actually saying so, I'm not sure if he felt that he would be booed out of the house if he said that, is that they are very definitely against development. Wherever there's a very strong Maoist, quote-unquote CPML, quote-unquote Naxalite, quote-unquote whatever movement, there is a very strong focus on preventing mining, preventing the setting up of modern industry, preventing the extension of roads and highways, and if any social infrastructure comes, for example, schools or hospitals, they should very quickly come under the control of these groups, or they will just not be allowed to operate in these areas unless taxes are collected and paid. In other words, very severe constraints on development is a very common strand in the ideology of all these groups. Now, these are some of the strands that are there in the ideology of these groups. We have all seen how the Indian is basically a moderate human being. You have explosions of violence in some parts of the country. A large part of that is motivated by politicians, is financed and funded by politicians, is not intrinsic to the Indian people. But nevertheless, India has had a very strong movement of armed terror by groups who falsely claim to be following Islam. I mean, Islam is definitely not a religion that sanctions terror. It's completely opposed to Islam, what they're doing now, but they act in the name of Islam. This has got salience and depth precisely because of external support from Pakistan. Now, Manjeet, we have been after the Mumbai attacks of 26 November, which incidentally I was in Taipei during that time. I saw it on the television screen. And much to my mortification, none of my friends who are active in this, whether in counterinsurgency or any other activity, saw fit to ring me up and tell me to watch my television screen, so I'm feeling quite humiliated. But the fact of the matter is that the briefings that I got at that point in time made it very clear that this was sponsored by elements of the Pakistan state and the Pakistan military. The level of planning, the level of sophistication, their logistical requirements, the training and the flow made it very clear this was state sponsored. When I wrote that in upiasia.com a few days after the attack, there was a lot of laughter, but today it's now generally accepted that this is the case. Now, why I'm saying this is, we have this major front of terror, which is now fueled by elements of the Pakistan Army and elements of the ISI. And I'd like to give, in the interest of full disclosure, that I am definitely an individual who has high regard for the Pakistan people. In fact, as proof of that, I'd like to say, I am one of 2 Indians who writes a regular column in a Pakistan paper. I write for a paper called Pakistan Observer. Mr. Kuldeep Nair writes for The Nation. I write for The Observer. But elements in the army are definitely funding this.